The sun came up hard over the Mojave Range, and by 6 in the morning it was already doing damage. Not the gentle warmth of a spring morning. Not the slow build of a summer afternoon. This was a hammer, flat, white, and immediate, the kind of heat that made the air above the asphalt shimmer like a mirage and dried the moisture from your lips before you could lick them. Soldiers who'd trained here for years still flinched in the first hour. New recruits learned quickly that the desert had no interest in their comfort, their pride, or their survival. It simply existed, waiting for the next mistake. Forward Operating Base Granger sat 12 miles southeast of Ridgecrest, carved into a shallow basin between two ridge lines that caught and held the heat like a bowl. The base had been here for 11 years, expanded twice, and still looked temporary prefab buildings, the color of dirty sand, a motor pool that smelled of diesel even at dawn, comms towers wrapped in rust from the seasonal dust storms, a water tower with a faded eagle stenciled on its side, a row of firing positions cut into the southern berm, angled toward a dry lake bed that stretched flat and merciless for 2 miles. This was where the 3rd Special Operations Support Battalion came to be tested. Sergeant First Class Dalton Webb stood at the edge of the equipment bay, coffee mug in hand, watching the new intake assemble on the parade ground. He'd seen a lot of intakes. He'd learned to sort them in under a minute, those who'd survived the first month and those who'd be on a bus back to reception by Friday. It wasn't about size. He'd seen enormous men quit on day 3. It wasn't about education. Some of the smartest candidates he'd processed had buckled under heat and sleep deprivation in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. It was something harder to name. A quality of stillness. He counted 11 new arrivals, 9 men, 2 women. His eyes moved without urgency down the line. He paused. The woman at the end of the second row was not what anyone would have expected. She was slight, not thin, but compact, as though built for economy rather than display. Her uniform was clean and properly pressed, which in itself was unremarkable. Her hair was pulled back to regulation standard. Her boots were polished but not mirror bright, a subtle choice that said she understood the difference between appearance and function. She stood easy, weight balanced, arms loose at her sides, not at attention, not at ease, just present. She was watching the firing range, not with curiosity, not with a wide-eyed intake assessment of someone seeing a military installation for the first time. With evaluation. Her eyes moved in small, precise arcs, checking distance, checking the angle of the sun on the berm, checking the way the flag on the range marker moved or didn't move in the early morning still. Webb noted it and said nothing. Colonel Raymond Harris did not watch the intake from a distance. He stood in front of them at 0630 sharp, hands behind his back, expression settled into the specific variety of professional indifference that took most officers 15 years to fully master. He was 51, lean, gray at the temples, with eyes that had spent 23 years looking at distances most people never had to look at. He'd served in 3 theaters, he'd trained in 6 countries, he'd sent men to places they didn't come back from, and he'd written letters to people who never wanted to read them, and he'd carried the weight of both with the same measured silence. He read the roster: Connolly, Bassett, Park, Moreau, Sheehan, Trevino, Ruiz, Delca, Hargrove. He paused. Voss. A brief pause at the last name. He'd noticed it on the paperwork the evening before. An unusual file. Sparse, which was unusual for an SFC candidate. Previous service, redacted, training history, partial disclosure, marksmanship assessments. 2 entries, both marked C classified attachment, which Harris had attempted to access and found locked behind a clearance he didn't currently hold. He'd made a note to follow up. He hadn't yet. "You're here," he said, "because someone decided you were worth the cost of transportation. That is the full extent of your welcome. Over the next 72 hours, you will be assessed on physical performance, tactical judgment, and marksmanship. Not in that order, and not with advance notice. You will be evaluated continuously. You will not know when the evaluation is occurring. You will be told when you are no longer required here, and not before." He let the silence sit. Question? No one spoke. Good. By midday, the temperature was 108 degrees. The physical assessment came and went. Connolly led the pack on the run. Moreau took a knee at the 6-mile mark and was quietly assessed and permitted to continue. Trevino struggled on the obstacle course but made up time on the dead hang. Standard distribution of strengths and failures. Voss finished 3rd overall. She did not sprint, and she did not labor. She ran at a pace that seemed to cost her nothing, and she crossed the finish line looking the same as she'd looked at the start. No performance of effort, no attempt to demonstrate more than she had. Webb had timed her splits. She'd run each mile within 4 seconds of identical pace, which was unusual enough to note. It was Bassett who said it first. He was from the South, built like a retired linebacker, with a voice that carried even when he was trying to be quiet. He said it at the water station during the afternoon break, and he said it with the confident ease of someone who'd never had to consider whether anyone was listening. How'd they even process her in? "She looks like she's lost." 2 men laughed. 1 didn't. Webb noted it and said nothing. Voss was at the far end of the station, filling her canteen. She did not look up. She did not respond. She capped her water, turned and walked back toward the range without acknowledging that Bassett existed, which, in Webb's experience, was the correct response. The long-range qualification began the following morning at 0500. The dry lake bed stretched south from the berm in flat, pale silence. Range markers had been placed at 5 positions 800 meters, 1,000, 200, 1,000, 600, 2,000, and a final marker at 2,000. 200 meters that caught the early light and threw a thin, red flag into the still air. The target array at 2,000 meters was a steel plate, 11 inches wide, mounted on a pivot post. It would not topple unless struck. There was no wind at 0500. By 0530, the wind came. It was the particular wind that only the Mojave produced, not a sustained blow, but a shifting, inconsistent current that changed direction over the course of seconds, moving through compass points in patterns that had no reliable logic. Old hands at the range called it the swirl. New shooters called it other things. Harris stood behind the line, watching. Connolly went first. He was good, technically clean, patient at the trigger. His first shot at 2,000 meters went wide by 14 inches. His second found the edge of the plate. Harris noted it as a qualified pass. Average. Moreau's first shot clipped the post. His second went into the dust 10 meters short. Harris noted the file. Remedial assessment required. Sheehan hit the plate on his first shot and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. The others went in order. Vos was last. There was, by now, a distinct quality to the attention the group paid her, not the attention of respect, but the attention of expectation, the specific anticipation of watching someone fail. Bassett had positioned himself 2 spots to the right of her designated firing station, close enough to ensure a clear view. He was not subtle about it. Webb watched from the berm. Voss settled into position. She took her time setting up, not slow in a way that suggested hesitation, but deliberate. She adjusted the bipod twice. She checked the scope with a series of small clicks that only she could hear. She set her elbow placement, shifted slightly, held. Then she waited. The flag at 2,000 meters moved in a slow arc. Left, then right, then left again, then a pause, then nothing. She didn't fire. The flag moved again. Right, sustained, then dropping. She didn't fire. Bassett exhaled loudly. Someone else shifted their weight. Harris said nothing. She had been still for 4 minutes. Then the flag went nearly flat horizontal, held, then rotating back. A specific movement that meant a very specific set of atmospheric conditions for approximately 1 second out of every 20. She didn't move. The flag dropped. Still. And then, without apparent preparation, without a visible breath hold, without any of the visible performance of concentration that most shooters wore like a uniform, she fired. The sound rolled out across the lake bed and vanished into the heat. 4 seconds of silence. Then the steel plate at 2,000 meters rotated on its pivot and settled. Harris checked the reading on the spotter scope. Center plate. Exact center. The plate had rotated true. The hit was within a 2-inch radius of the target's geometric middle. No one spoke for a moment. Then a second shot came. No one had seen Voss move. She was still in position, still against the stock, but she had cycled the bolt in a motion so compact it was nearly invisible, and she had fired again. The steel plate at 2,200 meters, the 5th marker, the one no one had been asked to engage, the one that sat beyond the qualification standard by 200 meters, rotated. Clean. Who cleared that shot? Harris said, his voice steady. That marker was not in play. Voss did not answer. She had set the rifle down, not dropped it, not placed it with ceremony. Set it down the way you set down a tool when you are finished with it. Harris said, louder. Who fired the second round? The group looked at Voss. She looked at the range. The interrogation, and that was the word Webb used in his private notes, because that was what it was happened in the briefing room before noon. Harris stood. Voss sat. Webb was at the wall. Bassett had not been invited but had managed to be nearby, which Harris noted and chose to address later. Walk me through the second shot, Harris said. I took it, Voss said. You took an out-of-scope shot on a live qualification range without authorization. I saw a window. I used it. That's not how this works. She looked at him. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at him with the expression of someone who had decided that silence was the most accurate response available. Harris changed direction. The first shot. At 2,000, walk me through the targeting correction. The flag was misleading, she said. How? The ground-level wind pattern was running 15 degrees offset from the visible indicator. The flag was catching a turbulence bounce off the berm wall. Actual projectile path correction was about 18 inches of hold-off to the right at the midpoint. The flag was suggesting 12. If you corrected to the flag, you'd miss left every time. Silence. Webb had been at this range for 3 years. He had explained that exact phenomenon, the berm bounce, the offset, to exactly one instructor, 8 months ago, and that instructor had not believed him until Webb had demonstrated it twice. Voss had arrived yesterday. How did you know that? Harris said. The way the sand moved at the base of the berm. The microcurrent. You can see it if you're looking at the right thing. And the hold time. You waited almost 5 minutes. 4 minutes, 40 seconds. The window was recurring every 22 to 26 seconds, but the duration was under 1 second. I was waiting for a clean cycle. Harris looked at her for a long moment. Where did you train? He said. It's in my file. Your file is partially classified. She said nothing. Bassett found her at the range maintenance station that afternoon, cleaning a carbine she hadn't fired. You had someone spot for you, he said, from somewhere. Remote feed. That's the only way you hit both. She kept cleaning. No one shoots 2,200 cold on a shifting wind with no spotter. I had a spotter, she said. He waited. The sand, she said, and kept working. He stood there for a moment, trying to decide if she was serious. He decided she probably wasn't, which was the comfortable conclusion, and he walked away. Webb, who had been standing at the far end of the station and had heard the exchange, wrote a 3-word note in his field journal. She had one. Harris pulled the performance logs after dinner. He did it the way he did everything that troubled him, methodically, in sequence, without hurrying to the conclusion. He sat at the desk in his operations office with a cold cup of coffee, the terminal screen the only light in the room, and he ran the numbers: shot angle, projectile velocity at reported muzzle, wind data from the automated weather station at the range, logged every 45 seconds, estimated holdover for the 2,000-meter shot, comparison against the hit signature on the plate, as captured by the spotter camera. The numbers held, not approximately, not almost a margin he'd have found plausible from any competent long-range shooter. They held to a precision that was, in his experience, outside the expected performance envelope of anyone operating cold on an unfamiliar range under wind conditions that had defeated every other shooter that morning. He pulled a separate folder. He'd had it in the file cabinet for 6 years, tucked behind quarterly assessment forms that nobody ever looked at. It was a copy of a training report he'd been given unofficially by a colleague at JSOC during a joint evaluation in Nevada. The report was 4 pages. The cover page was stamped with a clearance designation that he technically no longer held and had never officially acknowledged possessing. The subject of the report was listed as call sign, Desert Ghost, female, USSO, attached. Assessment period, 36 months. Verified engagements, classified. Notable characteristics: extreme patience at the trigger, aberrant environmental reading capacity, 0 confirmed misses across all scored evaluation exercises. Status as of the report's final entry: whereabouts unknown. Service record sealed per Directive 7. Zeta. Harris had read the report once, 6 years ago, and filed it where he thought he'd never need to retrieve it. He read it again now. Then he looked at the velocity numbers from today's qualification. They were the same, not similar, the same angle of correction, the same hold time signature, the same point of impact distribution slightly right of absolute center, by a consistent offset that matched the last 3 entries in the Desert Ghost assessment log. He sat for a long time with the 2 sets of numbers side by side. The desert doesn't lie. That was something his first instructor had told him, a long time ago in a different climate. Every shot leaves a record in the physics of what happened. The math doesn't care about your cover story. He closed both files. He didn't sleep well. Het told Webot utsas harmins. Not everything. Enough. I want a second evaluation. Staged. I want 3,000 meters on the far plate. I want the wind condition rigged. Run the auxiliary fans at the berm junction from 0800 until I give the stand down. I want every shooter assessed, but I want Voss to go last, and I want the condition at maximum difficulty when she shoots. Webb looked at him for a moment. That's not a standard evaluation. No, Harris said. If you're testing something specific, sir, it might be cleaner to just, I know what I'm doing, Sergeant. Webb nodded once and went to make arrangements. The auxiliary fans were diesel-driven units bolted to the berm face at 3 points, used for storm simulation during infantry training. When run simultaneously, they created an artificial turbulence pattern that compounded the natural swirl effect into something that experienced shooters described as trying to read 2 different languages written on top of each other. Harris had seen it close down the range for extended qualification periods. He'd seen it frustrate instructors with 15 years of Mojave experience. At 0800, he assembled the group. Second qualification, he said. Extended range, 3,000 meters. Wind conditions are elevated today. You'll shoot in roster order. He watched Voss. She was looking at the range flags, 3 of them at different intervals, all running in different directions. She was doing math he couldn't see. The other shooters went in order. Connolly 2 shots, both short by a significant margin. He took it with a flat expression and stepped back. Sheehan 1 shot in the dirt. He tried not to show it, and almost succeeded. The others produced a distribution of near misses and full misses that was entirely consistent with what Harris had expected. Nobody hit 3,000 meters under these conditions. Nobody he'd trained. Nobody he'd evaluated. He'd consulted the range record before this morning and found the 3,000-meter mark had only been cleanly struck twice in the last 4 years, both times by an instructor with a spotter and a full morning of atmospheric data collection. Voss stood at the line. The fans were running at full. The flags at the range markers were moving in tight, ragged arcs left, cut right, loop back, drop, lift. It looked like noise, like a system that had no readable pattern. She looked at it for a long time. No one said anything. The group had stopped making comments. Something had shifted in the air from the day before, the specific quality of silence that replaces mockery when mockery has become uncomfortable to continue. She didn't lie down at the shooting mat immediately. She knelt and put her fingers against the surface of the berm, feeling vibration, possibly, or heat gradient from the surface differential. Webb didn't know. Harris didn't know. No one asked, because asking would have meant admitting they were curious. Then she took her position. She was still for 7 minutes. No one moved. The shot, when it came, was unremarkable in the firing. No visible tension in the body. No exhalation. No dramatic pause. Just the absence of motion, and then the presence of it, a single, clean action that produced a sound and then was over. Harris had the range scope. He watched the 3,000-meter plate. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. A 3,000-meter shot traveled for roughly 3 seconds at this elevation and atmospheric density. The plate rotated. Harris lowered the scope. He stood with it at his side for a moment. The numbers on the range display automated ballistic tracking. Expensive, rarely accurate enough to matter, showed point of impact at 3,012 meters, with a horizontal deviation from target center of 1.3 centimeters. 1.3 centimeters. At 3,000 meters, in artificial turbulence. He looked at Voss. She had cycled the bolt and set the rifle down. She was looking at the flags again. Voss, he said. She turned. My office. 1,700. She didn't nod. She just turned back to the range. Bassett was standing 6 feet to Harris's left, and for once had nothing to say. His office at 1,700 was quiet. The fans had been shut down. The desert had reasserted its natural temperature, which was still punishing, but at least honest about it. Harris had his back to the window. He had the 2 sets of ballistic data on the desk, side by side, printed out and placed with careful alignment. Voss sat across from him. You can close the door, he said. She did. He looked at her for a moment. Not a challenge, an assessment. I'm going to use a name, he said. And I want you to not react faster than you actually want to. She waited. Desert Ghost, he said. Something happened in her eyes. It was not what most people would have recognized as reaction. It was the opposite of very specific stillness. The kind that comes from practiced suppression, the kind that only exists in response to something real. That file is sealed, she said. Her voice was neutral. I have a copy from a joint evaluation in Nevada, 2018. Unofficial. I've had it for 6 years without knowing what to do with it. Silence. The ballistic signature matches, he said, not approximately. Exactly. She looked at the papers on his desk. She did not ask to see them. She already knew what they said. The 2018 evaluation, she said. Who ran the joint program? Brigadier General Scott Faraday. Something moved across her face, brief and controlled. Tell me what happened, Harris said. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a vehicle crossed the motor pool. The water tower creaked in the evening wind. There was a mission, she said. February 2017. Restricted clearance. I can't give you specifics. Give me the structure. I was assigned as primary shooter on an interdiction operation. 2-man team. My partner was a man named Keegan Birch. He was good. One of the better spotters I'd worked with. She paused. The operation went wrong. How? The intelligence was wrong. The target brief was wrong. We were positioned on coordinates that should have been clear, and they weren't clear, and we spent 6 hours in a position that 3 separate teams had access to through a data link that shouldn't have been active. She stopped. I can't tell you what we found out when we got back. The operation was marked as failed, Harris said. Your status went to whereabouts unknown. The operation didn't fail, she said. The mission objective was completed. We came home. She looked at him. The reason my record was sealed was because coming home meant we knew something that someone didn't want known. Harris was very still. What did you know? He said. That the intelligence error wasn't an error. That the coordinates we were given put us in range of a friendly installation that was conducting operations that were not in any brief, that were not on any ledger, and that involved at least 2 individuals at the 07 level or above. The room was quiet. You were supposed to disappear, Harris said. I was encouraged to separate. My file was sealed under administrative provisions that technically exist for operational security purposes. Birch was reassigned overseas. I was told that continued service was inadvisable. She paused. That was 7 years ago, and now you're here. Faraday retired 8 months ago. The individual at 07 who was most directly involved died in April of a cardiac event. She said it without particular emotion. The provisions that sealed my record are still technically in place, but the people who wanted them in place are no longer in positions that allow enforcement. Harris looked at her for a long moment. Why come back through the standard intake process? Why not go through channels? Because channels are how I got erased the first time, she said. I wanted to see if I could come back as no one, and then become someone, and do it on terms I controlled. Harris sat back. He picked up one of the printed sheets and then set it down again. There are people in this intake group who've trained for years to get where they are, he said. And you shot 3,000 meters under full fan conditions on your second day. I know, she said. That's going to cause problems. I know that too. He looked at her. Are you planning on staying? She met his eyes. That depends on whether there's something worth staying for, she said. The intelligence brief came at 2,100. Harris read it twice before he called Webb. Get the senior shooters. My office. 20 minutes. The brief was from a signals intelligence intercept processed by a regional analysis cell in Nevada. A cell affiliated with a known hostile network had been tracking FOB Granger's communication pattern for 48 to 72 hours. The intercept included fragmentary reference to range assessment window and operational timing phrase that, in context, suggested the cell was aware of the current intake evaluation period and had been using it to triangulate the base's standby posture. Translation: someone had been watching. And the base's security posture during an intake assessment was, by design and tradition, lower than standard operational readiness. Half the senior team was embedded in training rotations. The external perimeter had 2 active sensors rather than the full 6. The rapid response team was on a modified rotation. How credible is this? Webb said. Credible enough that I'm not sleeping tonight, Harris said. What's the threat vector? Possibly sniper. Possibly 2-person element. The intercept references a 1,900-meter window from the eastern ridge, which would put a shooter behind the fuel depot and give clear line of sight to the communications array and the command module. Silence. Our best shooter right now, Webb said carefully, is someone who officially doesn't exist. Harris looked at him. I'm aware of the complication, Harris said. If we deploy her and something goes wrong, if we don't deploy her and something goes wrong, the outcome is worse. Webb was quiet. There's also the matter of the team, Harris said. They don't know who she is. They've spent 2 days deciding she's a novelty. You want to brief them? I want to give them enough to work with, Harris said. Not a full history. Enough context to know that she knows what she's doing and that tonight is not the night to question the seating arrangement. Webb nodded slowly. Bassett's not going to like it. Bassett can write me a complaint form in the morning, Harris said. He assembled the relevant personnel at 2145. Connolly, Sheehan, Webb, 2 experienced support personnel from the base's established team, a communications specialist named Aldridge, and a perimeter analyst named Torres, and Voss, who arrived last and stood at the back of the room without taking a chair. Harris kept it clean. We have a credible threat. Potential hostile sniper element. East Ridge, 1,900-meter approach vector toward the comm array. Window is likely between 0100 and 0400. Based on the intercept timing pattern, I want a counter position established on the ridge line by midnight. He looked at the group. Voss has the counter-sniper lead. Bassett wasn't in the room. He was on a different rotation. The people who were in the room looked at Voss with varying degrees of readiness and uncertainty. Connolly, who had seen her shoot that morning, said nothing. His expression had shifted into the specific blankness of a soldier reassessing a prior assumption. Sheehan nodded once. What's her classification? Torres said. Not hostile. Procedural. Sufficient, Harris said, which was technically true and intentionally incomplete. Any questions about the operational structure? None. Move at 2,330. Aldridge lingered after the others had cleared out. He was a careful man, 38, 12 years in communications, with the considered economy of someone who chose each word deliberately. Sir, he said. Harris looked at him. The intercept, Aldridge said. The phrase they used, range assessment window, that's not standard terminology for external actors. That's an internal phrasing. Someone on the inside provided at least partial operational awareness to the network we intercepted. Harris had already thought about this. I know, he said. That means whoever we're dealing with tonight isn't operating blind. They know the rotation. They know the standby posture. Yes. Aldridge looked toward the door through which Voss had just walked. And they may know about the intake assessment. They may know about several things, Harris said. Which is why tonight needs to produce a clean result, documented through proper channels, without anything attached to it that complicates the chain of custody. Aldridge understood. He nodded and left. Harris stood alone in the room for a moment. He was not afraid. He'd been in worse positions, but he was aware, the particular awareness that comes late in a career when you understand that situations are not isolated events but intersecting lines, and that lines have histories, and that the thing standing in the eastern dark tonight was not entirely separate from the thing that had sent a woman underground 7 years ago. He picked up his radio. He didn't say anything into it. He just held it. Then he clipped it to his vest and went to check the perimeter. The eastern ridge was 800 meters from the base perimeter and rose 40 meters above the valley floor. By day, it was a pale brown wall of broken rock and scrub. By night it became a thing of edges and shadows, the kind of terrain that made distance impossible to read and sound unreliable as a guide. They moved in 2 elements. Torres and Aldridge would hold the base side position at the perimeter wall and maintain communication with Harris. Connolly and Sheehan would establish a secondary observation post on the western approach to the ridge, a redundancy position, in case the intercept was designed to draw attention away from a secondary vector. Voss moved alone toward the ridge. Webb shadowed her to the 400-meter mark and then stopped. Counter-sniper is a solo approach? he said quietly. For now, she said. That's not standard. Nothing about tonight is standard, she said. He looked at her in the dark. She had already shifted the way she moved, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The quality of her motion in daylight, economical and measured, had tightened further into something nearly frictionless. She moved over the ground the way water moves through a channel, not fighting the terrain, simply finding the path of least resistance and taking it. If you need extraction, he started. I won't, she said. She moved on. The ridge had a secondary shelf at the 40-meter mark that most people would have missed, a narrow ledge of stable rock behind a formation of split granite that provided natural cover on 3 sides and a clean sight line to the east for approximately 2,200 meters and to the base for about the same distance south. She found it in 9 minutes. She lay flat on the rock and let the cold of it move through her gear. She regulated her breathing not because she was nervous, but because the body produces too much heat at rest on cold rock, and too much heat differential creates a subtle signature that experienced hunters recognize. She dropped her metabolic rate by intention, the way a person drops their shoulders when they choose to, the way you choose to be still. The eastern approach was a series of shallow gullies cut by seasonal water flow, running roughly parallel to the ridge from north to south. A 2-person element approaching from the east would use the 3rd gully. It was the only one with sufficient cover from the base's sensor arrays. She'd mapped it in her head on the walk up, cross-referencing the terrain against the approach vector from the brief. She'd also noted something else. The 3rd gully had a section, approximately 600 meters out, where the terrain opened into a flat shelf before dropping back into cover. It was unavoidable. An approaching team would have to cross it. They would be exposed for 4 to 6 seconds. She waited. 47 inches the morning. Movement in the 2nd gully, not the 3rd. She adjusted without sound, shifted her position by 8 inches to bring the 2nd gully into clean view, recalculated the flat shelf. It was in a different position from the 2nd gully, slightly narrower, but the principle held. She keyed her comms. 1 tap. The prearranged signal for contact, eastern approach, hold position. Aldridge confirmed with 1 tap back. She watched. 2 figures. Low. Professional movement. They knew how to traverse rough terrain without producing silhouette. The first was carrying something long, the second was moving in a support pattern, watching the base rather than the terrain ahead, which meant he was the second set of eyes and his partner was the primary shooter. The primary shooter reached the flat shelf. 6 seconds of exposure. She didn't fire immediately. She waited. The second figure, the support, moved to the edge of the gully cover and paused. He had a sight line to the communications array. He was ranging. Setting distance, she could see the movement of his arm as he raised something to his eye. She fired. Single round. Support figure down. The primary shooter dropped immediately, not from being hit, from reaction. He was good. He found cover in under 2 seconds and had the rifle raised. But he'd raised it toward the 3rd gully, because that's where she should have been, based on the approach vector from the brief. She wasn't there. She was 12 meters east and 40 meters above, on a ledge that nobody had put in the brief because nobody had scouted the ridge before tonight. She waited 4 seconds. He had to adjust. Every shooter adjusts after return fire fails to locate. He would recheck the geometry. He would move his barrel arc to scan for the actual origin. When he moved the barrel, she had the angle she needed. The second shot covered 1,140 meters through cool air, with no wind at 0148 hours. The threat ceased. She lay still on the ledge for 11 minutes after the second shot. Not from injury, not from shock, from discipline, the discipline of not assuming the situation had fully resolved, of waiting until the situation confirmed what the situation was, rather than what you wanted it to be. At 0159, Torres called in from the perimeter wall. All clear, no secondary movement. She keyed once, acknowledged, then she lay still for 2 more minutes. Then she rose, field-checked her position for any sign of her presence she'd prefer not to leave, found nothing of consequence, and began moving back toward the base. She reached the perimeter at 0220. Connolly was there. He looked at her. Then he looked at where she'd come from the ridge, in the dark, 2 kilometers away. He said nothing for a moment. He'd been standing at the secondary observation post when the first shot came across the valley, and he'd tracked the sound and done the geometry automatically, the way training made you do geometry, and he'd come up with an origin point that was not where any position in the brief had placed a shooter. He'd sat with that for the 20 minutes it had taken her to return. He'd been doing a lot of reassessment in those 20 minutes. You need medical? He said. No, she said. He nodded once, stepped aside. She walked past him toward the operations building. He watched her go. He'd been training for long-range engagement for 6 years. He'd competed at the national level twice. He'd spent 18 months studying wind behavior at extended range. He was, by most professional assessments, very good. He stood at the perimeter in the dark and understood, for the first time in a quiet and uncomplicated way, that very good and exceptional were not the same country. That there was a distance between them that was not simply a matter of more training or more time. That some people occupied a different position in relation to a specific skill, not mystically, not by luck, but through some convergence of aptitude and experience and relentless private discipline that produced a capability that looked, from the outside, like something other than what it actually was. He'd been one of the people laughing 2 days ago. He didn't feel good about that now. He turned back to his post and said nothing more about it. Harris was at the operations desk when she came in. He'd been tracking the communication feeds. He had the intercept summary, the contact log, Torres's perimeter report, and the range data from Aldridge's monitoring system on the table in front of him. He'd been building the picture in real time, the way 23 years had taught him to, assembling fragments into something coherent. He looked at her when she came through the door. She stood at the threshold. "Both confirmed?" he said. "Both confirmed," she said. He nodded. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Sit down." She sat. He pushed a water bottle toward her across the desk. She took it and drank without ceremony. "The ballistic data from tonight will need to be processed through the incident report," he said. "Torres has the perimeter logs. The formal report goes to the regional command by 0800. It will be accurate in its description of the engagement. It will describe the counter-sniper as an assigned team member." She looked at him. "There's a process for record restoration," he said. "It's slow. It's bureaucratic. It will take longer than it should because the provisions that sealed your file were written by people who didn't intend for them to be undone. But the process exists." "I've looked at the process," she said. "I can support it," he said. "Formally, as the commanding officer of a facility that documented a verified counter-sniper engagement under my operational authority tonight, I have standing to initiate an administrative review request. That carries more weight than a personal petition." She was quiet. "That's not an offer I'm extending out of charity," he said. "I'm extending it because what happened tonight means the record as it stands is a liability, and I don't like carrying liabilities." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, close to one. "Noted," she said. The briefing happened at 0700. The full group, the intake class plus the established base personnel who'd been involved or adjacent to the night's events. Harris stood at the front. Webb was at the wall, same position as always. Harris was brief. "Last night, this facility was the subject of a hostile reconnaissance and potential engagement attempt. The threat was neutralized. 2 hostile elements are confirmed down at approximately 1,100 to 1,200 meters East Ridge approach. No base personnel were injured. No base infrastructure was compromised." He paused. "The counter-sniper position was established and executed by a single team member who had been with this base for 48 hours. He didn't say her name. He didn't gesture toward her. The performance of that team member tonight was the difference between a disrupted base and a functional one. Between people going home and people not." He let that sit. "I've heard, over the last 2 days, a certain quality of opinion regarding the capability of unfamiliar personnel. I'm not going to give a lecture about it. I'm going to say one thing." He looked at the group. "Learn to see what you're actually looking at before you decide what it is." Silence. Connolly was looking at the floor with the careful expression of someone recalibrating. Bassett, who had found out enough by now to know what he'd missed, was looking at nothing in particular. One of the younger intake members, a man named Hargrove, who'd been quiet throughout, who'd watched everything without commenting, raised his hand. Harris nodded. "The person who ran the counter-sniper last night," Hargrove said. "Is that person going to stay on here?" Harris looked at the back of the room. Voss was standing near the door. Not hiding, not centered. Just standing where she'd come to rest, the same way she'd been standing since the first morning, present, balanced, watching. "That's her decision," Harris said. Hargrove turned to look at her. "Are you staying?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was young, 24, 25. He had the specific quality of seriousness that you sometimes found in people who'd chosen this path for reasons that weren't about performance or identity, but about something harder to name, the kind of seriousness that got better over time. "I'm thinking about it," she said. She left the briefing ahead of everyone else. Not rushing, not retreating. Simply finished before the room was finished, which was a quality she'd always had and had learned to stop apologizing for. The morning was already hot. By 0730, the temperature was climbing toward the day's first threshold. The sky was white with it. The flags at the range markers stood still in the early calm, waiting for the swirl to start. She stood at the edge of the vehicle bay and looked at the range, 2,200 meters to the far marker. The one she'd hit on the first day, uninvited, simply because the window was open and the shot was there. Webb appeared beside her. Not suddenly, she'd heard him coming. He had a coffee mug and the studied nonchalance of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "You going to stay?" he said. "You're the second person to ask me that today. First person was asking because he's curious about the legend," Webb said. "I'm asking for a different reason." She looked at him. "Because if you stay, I have work to do. And if you don't, I save myself the trouble of figuring out how to work with someone who's better than me and needs to know I know it." She considered that. "That's a strange kind of honesty," she said. "I've been here long enough to be tired of the other kind," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The flag at the 800-meter mark moved. A small flutter. The swirl coming in from the north, which meant the day's patterns would run counterclockwise. She filed it. "How long's Colonel Harris been here?" she said. 4 years. "He's got 1 year left before rotation." "Is he good?" "He's honest," Webb said. which in this job is most of what good means. She nodded. I'll think about it, she said. She drove out at 0900. Not a permanent departure. She hadn't cleared her bunk or her gear, and Harris hadn't received a separation request, which meant the administrative records still had her as active intake. But she drove out through the eastern gate in a base vehicle she'd signed out for a 4-hour window, and she drove north along the ridge road that ran parallel to the range, and she stopped at a point where you could look back down at the base from the elevation of the ridge. From here, FOB Granger was small and logical, precise in its layout: the parade ground, the range, the comms array, the vehicle bay, the prefab buildings in their practical rows. She'd been in smaller places. She'd been in quieter ones. She sat with the engine off and looked at it for a while. The math she was doing wasn't ballistic. It didn't involve wind speed or projectile drop or the angle of the sun on a target face. It was a different kind of calculation, the kind you do when you're deciding whether a thing is worth the cost of doing it, whether the ground beneath a structure is solid enough to build on. 7 years was a long time to be no one. She'd spent most of it being very good at a very specific thing, in contexts that never asked her real name and never would. She'd been useful. She'd been effective. She'd been, in the particular language of the work she'd always done, clean. But clean and right are not the same thing. The base flag moved below her. She could see it from this distance, a small square of color at the edge of the parade ground, catching the morning's first true wind. She watched it for a while, then she started the engine. She came back through the eastern gate at 1230. Webb was at the vehicle bay. He watched her park and didn't say anything. She walked past him toward the operations building. Back in 20, she said. He nodded once. She went in to find Harris. Harris was at his desk with a stack of administrative forms and the expression of a man who'd been told that paperwork was a necessary feature of command and had never fully made peace with it. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. I want to continue the intake evaluation, she said. Standard process. No special provisions. Whatever the timeline is, I do it the same way as everyone else. He looked at her. And the record restoration? Let the process run, she said. I'm not in a hurry. It could take 18 months. I know. And in the meantime, you're operating under an incomplete file. I've operated under worse, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Webb thinks you're going to be a problem, he said. Webb said the same thing to me and also said he'd do the work, she said. I think that's the good kind of problem. Harris looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the intake roster, the physical one, the paper form, with the 11 names in pencil, and he moved a single mark next to the last name. Not a check mark, a line. The kind that means continuing evaluation. 0600 formation tomorrow, he said. I know the time, she said. She turned and walked out. The desert outside was doing what it always did, burning, patient, without judgment. The flags at the range markers had found their morning rhythm. The swirl was in full rotation now, shifting through its compass points in patterns that most people couldn't read and a few people spent their whole careers learning to understand. She stopped at the edge of the parade ground. She watched the flags. She was already working out the pattern. The flags had a rhythm here. Everything had a rhythm, if you watched long enough and were willing to stop wanting it to be something other than what it was. That was the thing most people never learned. They watched the flag and tried to predict it based on what they wanted it to do. She watched the flag and tried to understand what it was already doing. It was a small difference. It was the only difference that mattered. She turned and walked toward the operations building to find Harris. Behind her, the range was waking up. The first dust of the day lifted from the berm face and moved south in a low sheet. 2 ground birds crossed the far edge of the lake bed and disappeared into the scrub. The water tower cast its long morning shadow across the parade ground, and in an hour the shadow would be gone, and the heat would be back, and the desert would resume its indifferent work. None of this was beautiful or poetic. It was simply accurate, a place doing what it did, in the manner it had always done it, without regard for the people who moved across its surface. She understood that quality. She'd worked to cultivate it in herself for a long time. It was different, though, when you were choosing to stay somewhere rather than choosing to leave. She thought about that as she crossed the parade ground. Then she went inside. She didn't come back to be remembered. She came back because the work wasn't finished. And this time, she came back on her own terms.